Okay, I want to welcome those who maybe join us at some point on YouTube, the Moorhead Church of Christ. Excuse me. Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the book of Job, and we're going to pick up where we left off last Wednesday, and that is finishing chapter 38. Now, to sort of bring our minds to the point where we need to be with this, recognize that after God allowed Satan to really inflict all this harm in his life, Satan's point is that, see, God, I'm going to show you that if you essentially take away all the blessings, he's going to turn away from you. He's going to curse your name. And the reality is that Satan should have recognized that God is omniscient. He would know in advance whether that would be the case or not. The devil should have really gave up the fight right there, because he would have known that God is omniscient. And yet they go through this exercise. Job is the one that God puts forward, and God essentially allows him to take everything from his life short of taking his life. Now, Job was a great man. Job was a righteous man. He was a holy man, and he walked with God. But God doesn't say, listen, Job, here's the arrangement myself and Satan came up with. So here's what's going to happen to you. Hang tight. We're going to go through this for a while, and then everything will get better for you. He doesn't know what's happening in his life. And the general thought of the time was that, if you're suffering, you must have sinned. And so that's the line of really approach that the three friends took that are mentioned in chapter 2 there. That's the approach that they took with Job. And then later, Elihu took a slightly different approach, and he was like, well, sometimes God disciplines us if we're doing things that we shouldn't. So his approach was a little bit different, but in the end, the idea is they believed that Job was sinning. And Job maintained his innocence. He never sinned. He's not saying I never sinned once, but Job would offer up sacrifices when he sinned, and he would try to live a righteous life. So he had no outstanding sin. There was nothing he knew of that he had done that he needed to repent for. And Job maintained his innocence. And in the midst of all of his struggling and suffering, he really called on God to give him a day in court. He called on God to let him present his case. And if he heard his case, then God would see that, Job is really right in this way, and that he's really being sort of unfairly treated by God, because he believes God has allowed this in life, but he feels like he's been treated unfairly. And there's a lot of back and forth between the four friends and Job, until finally, in chapter 38, God appears in a whirlwind. That's what we call a theophany, a visible manifestation of God. From the whirlwind, God talks to Job. And as we stated at the beginning of the chapter, is that God is going to be speaking some things, chapters 38 through 41, but Job is never going to get a response from God as to why he's suffering. What God does with Job is really establish his greatness, his power, his omniscience, in the hope that Job will come to recognize that God knows what he's doing. He's in control. He only does what's right. And really the idea is that Job should trust God no matter what, because God essentially is going to take care of him, even though he doesn't get an answer. And as we talked about that, the idea of the importance today, God is not necessarily going to have a private communication with us and say, here, I'm going to let trial in your life, and this is why. But the Bible does tell us in James that God does allow trials in life, and we know, sort of generally speaking, the reason why, and that is really to strengthen our faith. Not to crush our faith, not to wash us out, not to make us turn against God, not to get us to question his love for us and his care for us, but to make us stronger in our walk with him. It's easy to say, I'll follow God no matter what, and when everything's going your way, that's easy to do. But you really don't know how committed you are to God until you have a trial in your life, and you have to really determine for yourself. God already knows what you're going to do. You have to determine for yourself whether you're going to continue to walk with God or not. If you walk with God, you're going to be made stronger by it. If you give up on God, of course, it's going to wash you out, but it's basically the choice you make in relation to what God allows in your life. And this is what's happened with Job, is God has allowed a trial in his life. This is not a time to question God and demand answers and look at God as being unjust, but essentially recognize, there's a higher purpose at work that I don't understand, but I know that God is good. He only does what's right. And as difficult and challenging as this is, I need to be patient and I need to keep serving God. So we're going to pick up where we left off in beginning verse 34 of chapter 38. So God essentially is establishing really this greatness that he has, the power that he's control over everything, that he's the one that called into being the universe, and he's the one that essentially calls into play the storms and all these different things, and that's all under his power. This is kind of where we're at in a quick nutshell before we get here. So Ryan, if you want to read verses 34 through 38, please.
Okay. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind? Who can count the clouds by wisdom, or tip the water jars of the heavens, when the dust hardens into a mass and the clouds stick together?
Okay. So we're looking here again at verse 1. He says, God is asking these rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions mean it's a question that's really not asked for an answer. It is basically to emphasize a point. And really the point is that God has been asking Job a number of questions, and essentially the questions are all really designed to show Job that as much as you think you know a lot about me and my ways and my doings, I presented you a number of different things that you have no explanation for. You have no idea. You weren't involved with creating them, and you have no idea how they work. And it really shows, again, the idea that God is superior over man, and really sort of showing Job his place. The idea that Job's busy questioning God and wondering if God has really dealt with him fairly. And the idea is by showing him these things, the idea is God is establishing himself and saying, I am so far above you, Job. I'm your creator. I'm the one essentially am responsible for everything, and I know how everything works. And the idea is that is supposed to instill humility and trust in the one, in the Almighty who has the power to do all things and knows all things. So God is showing Job his superiority over creation. He asked Job if you can make it rain abundantly at his word, and of course the implied answer is no. God says, verse 35, can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? And God asks Job, can you command the lightning so that it comes to you as your servant to strike at a moment's notice? Think about that. And the idea is that Job is supposed to sort of sit back and take this in and think about it. And I talked about this the last time. The idea is that sometimes we may sort of think, we know a lot about God. And of course, everything that we know about God is what he's revealed. But there's a lot of things he hasn't revealed to us. That the idea is that sometimes we might think, well, beyond that, we might think that we know a lot about God. But in reality is we can't even answer the questions that God asked of Job. And the idea that teaches us humility. That teaches us to recognize, yeah, maybe God allowed something in my life, but you know what? This is the one who made everything, the one that's over everything, the idea that he cares for all of what he has made. And even though I don't understand it, I trust his judgment, and I know that in the end, everything is going to be okay. Job does not have this power to do what God does. Job is merely one of God's creations who is under God's power and authority. Verse 36, God says to Job, who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or has given understanding to the mind? And the exact meaning of this verse is difficult to understand. And again, I like to use different translations as I'm studying through this to help sort of maybe get a different perspective of what's being said here. And the New International Version says here in verse 36, who gives the ibis wisdom or gives the rooster understanding? The Amplified Bible says, who has put wisdom in the inward parts or in the dark clouds, or has given understanding to the mind or to the mediator. And so even the translators with this verse found it difficult to really get the specific understanding of what's being said here. But obviously, when we look at the verse, that God is showing Job again his superiority over his creation. God's wisdom and power Job just does not have, because he is just a man. What exactly is being expressed here in the words of verse 36 varies from translation to translation. However, the context of the verses 34 and 35, as well as verse 37, is God talking about clouds and rain and storm. And so the verse is probably best understood in context of clouds and rain and storm, which God has absolute control over. Any questions about these verses? Okay. Verse 37, God says, who can count the clouds by wisdom or tip the water jars of heaven? The idea is God is able to control the elements. You know, we talked about a little bit about the meteorologists. We're impressed by their great knowledge. They can look at weather patterns and they can say, you know, here's the next 10 days and here's sort of what's going to happen this day and this day. And, you know, pretty much happens just as they say. And they're like, oh, there's going to be a storm. And yeah, we don't know exactly what's all going to take place, but we're going to get some moisture, blah, 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 blah. And we're kind of impressed. These guys are pretty smart. But the idea is they've essentially learned by studying sort of weather patterns, whatever. But the idea is there's a lot of things they don't know. And more importantly, they don't have control over the weather. God does that. And so we tend to be impressed sometimes at what people can do, and we ought to recognize, even more importantly, what God can do. God is the one that can make it rain, and Job cannot do either of these things in terms of dealing with the clouds and making it rain. Verse 38, God says, when the dust hardens into a mass and the clouds stick together. The Amplified Bible reads, when heat has caused the dust to run into a mass and the clouds to cleave fast together. And this is talking about the parched ground when it's really dry before it rains. If there's no questions, we'll go right into the next verses. Jenna, if you want to read 39 through 41. Okay. Then we'll finish chapter 38.
Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair? Who prepares for the raven its nourishment when its young cry to God and wander about without food?
Okay, so now God will leave his line of questions directed at Job concerning the heavenly phenomena in favor of questioning Job about the animal kingdom. And so he is really getting started here, but he's going to go through the entire chapter 39 presenting really questions to Job about the animal kingdom. So verse 39 says here, can you hunt the prey for a lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? And one thing that has to be understood here is he's talking about what sort of causes the animals sort of really to do what they need to do in order to feed themselves. How does a lion know, hey, I need to go out and hey, that zebra looks pretty good to me. I need to go and kill that zebra so I can have something to eat. How does the lion know that?
His stomach is empty and
okay.
he knows what to do.
Okay, and you think about all the other things that the lions do in terms of knowing what to do to creep up on their prey and different things like that. There are a lot of things in the animal world that's quite different than for humans. The idea is animals deal with instinct. The idea that God doesn't have to necessarily tell each animal what they need to do every time they need to do something, but he's placed something in them. Man is a unique creature of God. We are made in the image of God, but animals aren't. And so God has essentially gave them something that's fundamental to their existence, so they essentially know how to survive. And so the lion essentially is acting off of instinct. Hey, I'm hungry. There's a zebra. Hey, I think I'm going to go get that zebra because the zebra looks good. And so the idea is God is the one that gave him that instinct. And so God asked Job, how did the animal kingdom, come to have instinct in order to survive? And of course, the idea is well, God is the one that supplied that. This is one of those things, again, if you are a really thinking man, the idea that Job is a righteous man, he deeply considers the things of God, this is being presented to him to really give some deep consideration. Again, the idea is Job, you've questioned me. You've wondered about why I've done this and allowed this happen to you, and you're failing to recognize that I've done all these things, that I know what I'm doing. The idea is you need to just trust that I'm going to take care of you. You don't need to ask why, but you need to learn to trust. And that's the same thing that we have today in terms of our trials. We need to learn to trust God, even when we don't get the why question answered. Verse 40, God says to Job, about the lions, when they crouch in their dens, they lie in wait and in their lair. And so the idea that they're there, they're taking refuge, they're out of sight of their prey until the right moment when they sort of come out and go to a place where they can catch their prey. Verse 41, God says, who prepares for the raven its nourishment when its young cry to God and wander about with food? So Job, who do you think provides even for the ravens in their time of need? And the idea is God is the one who not only made the ravens, but he's the one essentially that supplies all that they need. The idea of God's greatness. We live in a culture where God is sort of talked down upon. The idea that nobody needs God. God is just religion. You just do whatever you want or whatever. But we wouldn't have our next breath without God. We wouldn't have the seasons. We wouldn't have the crops. We wouldn't have everything we need. We depend upon God because not only did God make us, he made the environment in which we live, and he supplies all that we need to survive. And so to hear people sort of say, I don't need God and God is religion, is really just hearing people really accept, ignorance that is passed on by others who really don't want people to believe in God. Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I mean, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer this, but
Sure.
I wonder what Job's friends are thinking when they're hearing God talking to him like this.
Yeah.
They probably I would imagine, be pretty scared or something, because they were making a lot of accusations toward Job, and here's God.
Right.
Sometimes
we don't, and that's a good question. We don't really understand. Like it seems like as we read this that Job's friends are going to be dependent upon Job in the end here, and you would think that the majority of this would be more or less given to them to consider, but the friends really aren't spoken about as highly by God, as Job is. And the idea is that we kind of get the impression that God is, really trying to help Job. Job is the one that's going through all the struggles. He's the one. He hasn't got any real answers from his friends, just accusations. And God is sort of giving him an indirect answer to his questions. I made everything. I'm on top of everything. I control everything. I know everything. And what is implied is you're in good hands. Trust me, it's going to be okay. And it seems like the motive is not so much, the friends. The friends will be dealt with at some point, but the idea is to somewhat console Job through all of this.
No, but I mean, like, just the fact that God is speaking.
Yeah.
Like, it'd probably be like, it's kind of scary, like, I think of, how people were, like, when Moses in the burning bush.
Yep.
Like, he got, as soon as he got close, he was scared,
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's things like that where, like, why doesn't he start out talking to the friends, or why, all right, all of you guys, listen up. Here's, all we do is speculate. And we don't know. But he decided, he talked to Job, and that seems like the best course of action.
Yeah.
So we're going to go right into chapter 39. God continues asking Job rhetorical questions to show him that he is far above man in power and knowledge. God continues to point to the animal kingdom as evidence of that, of his superiority over man. He knows all there is to know about the animal kingdom. He cares for it. Much of the knowledge about these creatures man does not know. What the experience that Job and his friends have really what they have pretty good knowledge of is domesticated animals. But God wants to say, what about all these other creatures? What do you know about them? And the idea is, Job, you're questioning why I've dealt with you in the way that you did. And yet I'm asking you, I made these creatures, I know how they operate, and I can answer all these questions. So this should teach you something about me that essentially, I know what I'm doing. Okay? So Job is not going to be able to answer the question. Say, God, I know the answer to that. He doesn't know. And the idea is that you're dependent upon God for whatever answers and responses and dealings that he has with you. So we're going to start out with the first 4 verses. Ruthie, would you like to read or pass? The first 4 of chapter 39, please.
Okay. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young, or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill, or do you know the time when they bear young? They bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. Their young ones are healthy, they grow strong with grain, they depart and do not return to them.
Okay, very good, thank you. So Albert Barnes really talks about it. He's a commentator, wrote the Barnes Notes on the book of Job, and sometimes when I'm studying this and really trying to get what's being implied here, sometimes it's hard to really get all that, but I liked what he had to say here about the mountain goats, and he says, quote, that is the particular season when the mountain goats bring forth their young. Of domestic animals, the sheep, the tame goat, etc., the habits would be fully understood, but the question here relates to the animals that roamed at large on inaccessible cliffs, that were buried in deep forests, that were far from the dwellings and observation of people. And the meaning is that there were many facts in regard to such points of natural history which Job could not explain. God knew all of their instincts and habits, and on the inaccessible cliffs and in the deep dell, in the dark forest, he was with them, and they were the objects of his care. He not only regarded the condition of the domestic animals that had been brought into the service of man, and where man perhaps might be disposed to claim that they owed much of their comfort to his care, but he regarded also the wild, wandering beasts of the mountain where no such pretense could be advanced, unquote. The deer here is another wild animal that man at times did not know a lot because it was not a domestic animal. I think we got people today in the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, they study all the wildlife, they do things with the fish and all that. We have a lot better understanding of some of these things than we did. But in Job's time, they didn't have people going out studying wild animals. They understood sheep and they understand these domesticated animals and sort of knew things about them. But God is going to stretch Job and say, what about all these other creatures? What do you know about them? And the answer is I don't really know, because it's really sort of been something that's out of their sight, and yet they survive, and God takes care of them. And God takes care of the deer as well, and out of which give birth to their young out of the sight of humans. God says, can you count the months they fulfill, or do you know the time they give birth? They kneel down, they bring forth their young, they get rid of their labor pains, their offspring becomes strong, they grow up in the field, they leave and do not return to them. And the phrase here, they leave and do not return to them, talking about the offspring, is the offspring of these animals are able to take care of themselves. They do not stay with their mother that gave them birth. God gave them the instinct necessary, essentially, to, at a certain point, to sort of go off on their own and survive and propagate their own kind at the appointed time. If there's no questions, we'll go right to 5 through 12. Ryan, do you want to read that?
Sure. Hold on a second. Who sent out the wild donkey free, and who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I gave the wilderness for a home, and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountains for his pasture, and searches after every green thing. Will the wild ox consent to serve you, or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because his strength is great, and leave you labor to him? Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor?
All right. Okay. So here we're looking at verse 5 here. Who sent out the wild donkey free, and who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? Well, guess what? God wants Job to recognize it wasn't you, Job. This is something that God made this creature. This creature has an independent spirit. It is wild and it is not domesticated. So you don't really understand this, Job, but I do, God is saying. In verse 6, God says, to whom I gave the wilderness for a home and the salt land for his dwelling place. The idea is he's not living in some penned up area where humans are sort of taking care of them and deal with them. But the idea is his home is out in sort of the open range. That is his habitat. And here it talks about the second phrase here, verse 6, and the salt land for his dwelling place. The Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon talks about the salt land, talking about a dwelling place of the wild donkey, or a salt plain. And if you look this up, the salt land or a salt flat is a salt encrusted flat area resulting from evaporation of a former body of water. And so the idea that the water is dried up, and this is sort of talking about the dwelling place of the wild donkey. Verse 7, God says about him, he scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. And so because he's wild, he's not going to be sort of found in the city. Because the wild donkey is not domesticated beast of burden, he is not going to hear the one that drives those donkeys that are domesticated, that have the pack and so forth. They're not going to heed the commanding of the driver. Okay, verse 8. God says he explores the mountains for his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. God provides food for the wild donkey in the wilderness, not by the hand of man. The idea is that man thinks, well, look, if these donkeys aren't taken care of by me, if these sheep aren't taken care of me, they're not going to have what they need. Well, Job, let me stretch you a little bit here. Who takes care of all these other animals out here that are not domesticated? Wow, that's quite an undertaking. All of them have to be taken care of as well. And so God provides food for the wild donkey in the wilderness. It's not taken care of by the hand of man. And then in verse 9, God says, will the wild ox consent to serve you, or will he spend the night at your manger? Does anybody have something different than a wild ox here in verse 9? Nope. Okay. The point is, a wild donkey will not do these things because he is not tame. And the reason why I bring this up, verse 10, is can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes, or will he herald the valleys after you? The reason why I bring this up is if you had a King James Version Bible, it wouldn't say wild ox there. You know what it'll say? Unicorn.
What?
I kid you not. Okay, so the reason why I bring that out on purpose and stop here is because you're going to have somebody that maybe learns that and comes to you and say, you guys believe that the Bible's from God, right? And we say, yep. You believe everything in the Bible is true, right? And we're like, yep. Well, here, look at this passage here in Job chapter 39, verses 9 and 10. God's talking about a unicorn. And so the reason why we want to stop and give this some thought is because we have some explaining to do. What I'll say before I get any further is that there are no other translations besides the King James that has that.
I just have a quick question before that. So you were saying the wild ox is a donkey?
Well, we're talking about something different. We talked about the wild donkey, now we're going to talk about
okay.
a wild ox.
Okay, I was like, wait a second.
And the wild ox, well, I'm sorry if I
Okay.
confused the way. We're changing animals here. Now we're
Okay.
going to a wild ox. And in the King James Version, it's called a unicorn. So, we want to give this some thought here. And as I studied for this, I really liked what Wayne Jackson said here in the book of Job. He says, quote, most scholars believe that the word Reem, and that's how you say the Hebrew word here, Reem, refers to a large, fierce ox of the ancient world that is now extinct. Translators of the Septuagint, now the Septuagint is a translation of scriptures that Jesus and the apostles used. It was the Hebrew Old the Hebrew Old Testament translated into Koine Greek. That's the first translation. So when he says Septuagint or LXX, that's what he's talking about here. The translators of the Septuagint rendered Reem by the Greek term monokeros, or one horn, on the basis of the relief presentation. So we're talking about stuff like the Egyptians had chiseled on walls, okay? On the basis of the relief presentations of the wild ox in strict profile, which they found in Babylon and Egyptian art, it has thus found its way into the King James Version as unicorn, and this is incorrect. In other words, they weren't trying to really to present something that was mythical as true, but they sort of mislabeled this creature. It was one horn, and that's the term that they sort of came up with. But you can obviously see how that works against you as you're a Christian, and somebody points that out and say, well, wait a minute, unicorn is a mythical creature. So you believe unicorns were actually in existence? No, we don't. But this is, remember the King James Version was written on much later texts that they had when they translated. We have now, since the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have texts that go back quite a bit there earlier in date, and every other translation I know of would have wild ox, because that's really what it's talking about here. The wild ox is another example of an animal that man cannot tame or control. While a domesticated ox is useful, you can essentially hook them up with leather straps and like a crude instrument in order to make a trench or furrow in the ground, or you can use a team of oxen to essentially have another implement there that essentially is used to break up sort of the chunks of the dirt and make it level. A domesticated ox is going to be useful, but man, well, he knows how to control and deal with a domesticated ox. He doesn't know how to deal with a wild ox. You'll never be able to get a wild ox and get them to do what a domesticated ox does. God knows essentially how to deal with the wild ox. He knows all about the wild ox because he's the maker of it, and Job is not going to be able to bind the wild ox and use him for farming. Okay, any questions about that? The unicorn business, all that? Okay. Verse 11, God says, will you trust him? He's talking about the wild ox. Because his strength is great, and leave your labor to him. Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor? In other words, you're not going to have faith in him because he's wild, and he's not going to be able to be useful in any sort of farm operations that you have. You're not going to be able to help you, put the seed down, and you're not going to be able to use him in order to bring in the harvest. A threshing floor is a place that grain would essentially be processed. So you essentially cut all the grain and the stalks, you take it to this sort of hardened place, and you basically beat the grain out of the stalks. And that's really a processing plate in ancient times for that. The wild ox would never do these things. We're going to go to verses 13 through 18. Jenna, would you like to read that for us, please?
The ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love, for she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. And she forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may trample them. She treats her young cruelly as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned, because God has made her forget wisdom and has not given her a share of understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider.
All right. So now God is going to, we talked about the wild donkey, we talked about the wild ox. Now God is going to direct Job's attention to ostriches. This is a creature that's sort of out in the wild. The idea is Job, in giving all this consideration, I know it seems to us, maybe in reading, it's a lot of redundance. In other words, okay, we got the point already, but the point isn't essentially to, sort of run over Job with all this and really, sort of beat a dead horse. But the idea is Job, I want you to really give this some thought and consideration, because you're questioning my dealings. You're wondering about why I let you do all these things. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to open up your mind and get you to see the greatness I have. Now, you talked about my greatness. I'm getting ready to show you, really, in talking about these things, the vastness of my greatness and the vastness of my knowledge, compared really to what you can do. And so this is all used not really to punish Job, but really to sort of get him to see God in a greater way. So God directs Job's attention to ostriches. Man has limited knowledge of the creatures that God has made. Man struggles at really understanding those creatures that he doesn't really have dealings with. The ostriches here would be one right here. The ostriches, verse 13, the wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love. And the NIV says the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and the feathers of a stork. And so there's some question about this Hebrew word love or plumage of love and how that should be. But the idea seems to be here, whether it's talking about the plumage or the covering of feathers, the idea that sort of they're lovingly, or whether it's talking about the stork, that they're sort of more loving because they care for their young, they have more concern for their young versus the ostrich. That we don't know, but the idea is he's presenting really the ostrich itself for consideration. In verse 14, in talking about the ostrich, it says, for she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. And so we wonder about sort of, is God sort of presenting this from the perspective of man, because it seems like the ostrich is very careless, and yet the ostriches, if they sort of carelessly lay their eggs and they get trampled on by creatures and people and whatever, if all the eggs are always getting destroyed or whatever, they wouldn't survive to today. So what exactly is God sort of using the viewpoint of the way man sees it, because he hasn't really studied the ostriches, or is God sort of using this sort of on his own to explain this? The ostrich's ways are hard to understand from man's perspective. The female seems heartless as she lays her eggs and buries them in sand, leaves them behind to incubate as she searches for food. Did God give the ostriches less wisdom, verse 17, than other creatures, or does he only seem does it only seem that way because man does not really understand really more about the ostrich in terms of the way that they do things? Verse 15, God says about the ostrich, and she forgets that a foot may crush them or a wild beast may trample them. And one commentator in talking about this said that really if the eggs get broken, those eggs that survive can actually use those broken eggs for the hatchlings that do survive for food. But going to Job's day, in ancient times, they didn't have studies about wild animals and birds as we do today. But man back then did not understand the ways of the ostrich, and they did not manage to really observe the full price. So what they seen of wildlife, they saw. and they didn't necessarily go out of their way to see what happens, 24/7 and all the different things that happens with them. They just saw what they saw, and the idea is they didn't have a complete picture of the wildlife. Today we have cameras. Well, they'll put cameras in where an eagle's nest is or something, and essentially somebody can turn on their computer, they record everything, somebody can watch what they're doing, they can see how their young are getting fed, what they're getting fed, how they how they really sort of, they're going out to get food and things like that, and just all of the things about animals. We have that, but they didn't, and so their understanding was very, very limited. Verse 16 about the ostrich, she treats her young cruelly as if they were not hers, though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned. And so the treatment of the ostrich young is compared to other birds. So compared to other birds that maybe Job understood, this seems kind of, callous. So if a predator comes near the ostrich and the ostrich runs away, you're thinking, hey, what about your young? The problem is the ostrich running away from the nest in order to capture the attention of the predator to go after the ostrich? Okay? And so the idea is it might not seem as callous as it is presented. Now, again, is God seems to be presenting sort of man's perspective of the ostrich, because, the idea is God's behind really creating the ostrich, and really the ostrich has instinct and survives even today, okay? Verse 17, because God has made her forget wisdom and has not given her a share of understanding. Jameson, Faust, and Brown commentary on Job here says, quote, wisdom such as God gives to other animals and to man, Job 35:11. The Arab proverb is, quote, foolish as an ostrich, unquote. Yet her very seeming want of wisdom is not without wise design of God, though man cannot see it, just as in the trials of the godly, which seem so unreasonable to Job, there lies hid a wise design, unquote. Verse 18, God says about the ostrich, when she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider. Again, this is in poetic language, and they're speaking in language in ancient times, so we don't always understand some of the phrases and what's exactly being presented. So she is talking about the ostrich. So the idea seems to be that the ostrich essentially has a great ability for speed. As sort of odd as this bird is, it doesn't fly, but it has pretty good speed, and so it can move very quickly, a speed of about 40 miles per hour to flee capture. And so they can sort of zigzag, and they can just go down the road to get away from predators.
And I think in some countries they have ostrich races.
And they got huge eggs too.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, let's see where we're at here. Let's go to 19 through 25. I think we can sneak through all this. Do you want to read that, Ruthie? 19 through 25, please.
Have you gotten a horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He marks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and javelin. He devours the distant with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sound.
Okay, now verse 25. Yep.
At the blast of the trumpet, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting.
All right, so now God's going to change this to talking about the war horse. And not every horse is suited for a horse to go out and battle, but God moves this creature, and it seems he's especially proud of this war horse. And God asked Job, who is really a mere man, about this war horse, to which Job cannot answer, yes, I understand all about this. But God knows, because he created the horse and he knows what the horse is able to do. So in verse 19 he says to Job, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? And Job would have to say, nope, I don't. The idea is yeah, but I did that. The idea that the awe and the respect for God, Job, I did that. You can't answer that. But not only did I make it, I can tell you all about him. In verse 20, God says to Job, do you make him leap like a locust? His majestic snorting is terrible. And what God describes here is talking about the war horse going into battle. Job cannot make the war horse leap in battle. He is not able to do what God has been able to do with making this creature. And the idea of something majestic is awe-inspiring, something that takes away your breath because it's so impressive. And the idea of a horse snorting, the idea of forcefully breathing through its nose, and the idea that this is something that would be very intimidating going into battle. Verse 21, God says, he paused in the valley. He's talking about the war horse and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. And it really sort of shows the idea the war horse is fearless. The idea that he's pawing with his hooves in the dirt. He's eagerly awaiting to go into battle. In talking about the war horse, verse 22, God says, he laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. And the idea is that the war horse is not thinking about all the things that could go wrong. He's just ready to go into battle. He's ready to go into battle with his rider, even though there's all this fighting and people dying and all this chaos going on. He's ready to go because that's how God made him. Verse 23, the quiver rattles against him, the flashing spear and javelin. And so we're talking about the quiver is what holds the arrows of the one who has the bow. And the idea is the war horse charges toward the enemy, is not spooked by the sight of deadly instruments and the sound of battle all around him. He is unafraid. The javelin and the spear seems to be somewhat equivalent instruments, but a spear is something the soldier would actually sort of probably lunge to another soldier with and try to take out a vital organ or whatever, where a javelin would be something more like you would throw. Spear would be heavier, javelin would be lighter. Verse 24, God says, with shaking and rage, he races over the ground and does not stand still at the voice of the trumpet. And so the idea that the phrases he races over the ground is talking about this swift gallop of the horse. And he does not stand still at the voice of the trumpet. The trumpet is blown, but that doesn't affect his world. The idea is that he can hardly contain himself. And the trumpet here is what they call a shofar in Hebrew. And this is from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. It talks about the trumpet here sort of being used from a ram, so it was a ram's horn. And here it's talking about it as a signaling instrument. In this case, it is to sound an attack. And so the war horse is so wrapped up in sort of the what's going on and the heat of the battle that when the trumpet blows, it cannot hardly be restrained to stand still. Verse 25, as often as the trumpet sounds, he says, aha, and he scents the battle from afar in thunder of the captains and the war cry. And Brown Driver Briggs, talking about this, the English word aha, and talking about the Hebrew word here is expressing joy. And it's used metaphorically here of the neighing of a horse, a war horse in battle. And so the idea that this is the horse is sort of the noise the horse is making in communication in the battle. So the senses and the instinct of the war horse are uniquely given to him by their creator, Almighty God. Man can only wonder in awe of the handiwork of God in making the war horse. So let's do verses 26 through 30. We're that close. Where do we leave off? You. Okay, Ryan, you want to do that?
Sure. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the cliff he dwells and lodges, upon the rocky crag, an inaccessible place. From there he spies out food, he sees it from afar. His young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he.
Okay. So in verses 26 to 30, God finishes chapter 39 presenting the hawk as a testimony to God's omnipotence, his omniscience for God, the omniscience of God for Job to consider, as God's intention is to show Job that he is far above man and reigns supreme over his creation. So let me present something else. The idea is God continues to pull out these animals that exist in the wild, to which Job would say, I have no idea. I didn't make it. I don't understand it. It just is there. And God essentially said, well, I made it. I understand everything that creature does. So we asked in verse 26, is it by your understanding the hawk soars, stretching his wings towards the south? And the answer is no. Job does not know how the hawk flies through the sky. And the phrase here, stretching his wings to the south, is really talking about migration. The Amplified Bible says, is it by your wisdom, Job, that the hawk soars and stretches her wings toward the south as winter approaches? Job has no idea how the hawk soars. The idea is he can't explain. Job, tell me how does the hawk fly? Doesn't know. How does it know to essentially migrate? Job doesn't know. And the idea is God, Job, think about it. I'm your God. I'm in control of everything. You're one of my people. You're going through all this suffering. But you know what? I know you. I know your needs. I know what you're going through. But recognize I'm on a higher level than you, Job, and you essentially have to recognize that I completely understand the situation and everything's under control. Next, he's going to move from the hawk here to the eagle. In verse 27, it says, is at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high. Job doesn't know how the eagle can fly so high and make its nest, and it's said that the eagle can fly as high as 10,000 feet. So, I mean, that's a pretty high elevation for an eagle. And it also, the idea that the eagle is very interesting creature in what it's able to do. Essentially, it dwells in high places. A rocky crag is sort of a rugged rock or cliff. And the idea is it actually makes its nest where nobody can really get to it. And then he says, verse 29 about the eagle, from there he spies out food. He sees it from afar. And it said that an eagle can spot his prey 3 miles away. I mean, that's some incredible eyesight. And yet the idea is God is the one that made this incredible bird. About the eagles, in verse 30, the last verse here, his young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. So Job does not know any of the answers. He doesn't know how the animals in nature do what they do by instinct, and yet they all essentially are taken care of. They have what they have. They survive. They do what they need to do, even without Job having no understanding about it. Okay, any questions or comments about this chapter? Okay, not, then we will say goodbye to our virtual audience here on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. God willing, we'll be back here a week from now on Wednesday to go into chapter 40. God bless you.